All right, so get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into Victorian London, trying to untangle a mystery that still kind of sends shivers down your spine, Jack the Ripper. And you've outdone yourself with the source material this time. We're talking historical articles, encyclopedia entries, even some early attempts at criminal profiling. It's like we've opened a window right into the past.
And the really crazy thing is how a case this old, well over a century, can still grab people's attention like it does. It really makes you think about the power of the unknown.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess our mission, and we're definitely accepting it, is to cut through the fog and separate the Jack the Ripper facts from the fiction. We're going to put ourselves right there in 1888 Whitechapel and see if we can uncover anything new along the way.
Sounds like a challenge worth taking on.
Let's paint a picture for our listeners. Imagine London, but not the London you see on postcards. We're talking Whitechapel in 1888. This was a district crushed by poverty, crammed to the brim with people, and with a crime rate that would make your hair stand on end. Our sources don't hold back. It's a vivid picture, but honestly, it's a grim one.
And to really grasp the situation, you got to remember the historical context. Whitechapel was dealing with this massive wave of immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Eastern European Jews escaping persecution. They came looking for a better life, but what they found were these really rough conditions. So naturally, there's this tension, a feeling of unease that kind of seeped into everyday life.
It's like all the ingredients for something to blow were just simmering in this one district. And then throw in the plight of women, especially those who had no choice but to turn to prostitution just to stay alive. The sources are really, really honest about the dangers those women faced every single day. It's truly heartbreaking.
Yeah, and it raises a chilling question. Could something similar happen in a modern city? Maybe not with the same backdrop exactly, but the core issues, the inequality, the exploitation, those haven't gone away. It makes you think.
It really does. So let's talk about why Jack the Ripper is etched into history. The victims. We're focusing on who are often called the canonical five, basically a term used to group these murders together based on where and when they happened and, well, the level of brutality inflicted. Their names are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These were real women with real lives that were tragically cut short, and it's important to remember that.
These canonical five murders happened between late August and early November of 1888. They're linked by just how horrific they were and the fact that whoever was doing this seemed to become more and more bold, more brazen with each attack. The level of mutilation on the victims got progressively worse, and that suggests a pretty terrifying psychological shift in whoever was responsible.
And there's one night that sticks out, September 30th, 1888. On that one night, two women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were murdered just hours apart. Can you imagine the fear that gripped Whitechapel after that?
This double event is what it's called sometimes, and it's important for a couple of reasons. First, the audacity of it. This killer felt so confident that they could kill twice in such a short amount of time, but also it really shows the limits of what the police could do back then. They had a huge investigation, thousands of interviews, hundreds of suspects, but they couldn't stop this from happening.
And just think about it. They didn't have any DNA analysis, fingerprinting was barely a thing yet, and forensic science as we know it simply didn't exist. They had to rely on people who saw things, and those accounts often contradicted each other. Plus, they're trying to put the pieces together with very limited tools. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle in a pitch-black room.
Spot on. A crime scene today would be crawling with forensic experts. We'd have security footage, DNA databases, the works. Our chances of cracking a case like this would be off the charts. But back then, the Ripper was shrouded in anonymity, which only made the public more scared.
And speaking of fear, let's talk about how the name Jack the Ripper, which is just a name, became a symbol of terror. The name itself popped up in a letter, maybe a hoax, sent to the Central News Agency. But it was like someone poured gasoline on a fire. The media went nuts for it. And just like that, the legend of Jack the Ripper was born.
That's where you really see the media's power, even back then, to shape how people see things. Newspapers would kill for every little detail, every gruesome update. Headlines designed to shock, often based on rumors or outright lies, became the norm. It's a reminder that even when we're looking for the truth, the lines between what's real and what's made up can get really blurry.
Makes you wonder, right? With the news cycle running 24/7 today and social media blowing everything up, would a case like Jack the Ripper cause that same level of frenzy? Or has the way we consume information, for good or bad, changed the game?
That's a fascinating question. I have no doubt a case like Jack the Ripper would dominate headlines and social media. But we're also a lot more aware of misinformation these days. We understand how easy it is to twist a narrative. The challenge then would be sifting through the noise to find the truth.
You're right about that.
Hmm.
Okay, let's bust some common myths about Jack the Ripper, because separating fact from fiction is essential here. One stubborn myth is that the killer was this expert surgeon, someone with real anatomical knowledge because of how precise the mutilations were. But our sources say that's just not true.
That's right. The police surgeon who examined the victim said that while the killer was clearly brutal, there was no sign of surgical precision or specialized anatomical knowledge. The mutilations, although horrific, were described as rough and jagged. That points more to rage than surgical skill. I think this myth probably took hold because people wanted to believe that the killer was something extraordinary, almost mythical, instead of someone terrifyingly normal.
Right, like believing it was a monster made it easier to accept than a man. Another misconception is that Jack the Ripper only targeted prostitutes. Some historians are saying that labels been used too broadly, and that not all the victims actually fit that profile.
That's a good point. There's been research suggesting that focusing solely on that prostitute label really dehumanizes these women. It also ignores the bigger societal issues going on. Some of these women might have turned to sex work to survive, others might have been misidentified, and still others might have been targeted for completely different reasons.
It's amazing, isn't it, how we as humans tend to grab onto simple narratives even when they're not the whole picture. Why do you think we're so drawn to myths, especially with historical events like this one?
Myths often bring a sense of order to a world that feels chaotic. They offer easy answers to complicated questions. With Jack the Ripper, the myth of the surgeon, or the focus on prostitutes, creates a simple story, but it's a story that hides more than it reveals.
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but with only half the pieces. You might think you've got the picture, but you're missing vital parts of the story.
Precisely. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, those missing pieces of the truth about the victims, what was happening in society, the limits of what the police could do, those are all critical if we want to understand why this case still resonates today.
And speaking of that impact, well, that's exactly where we'll be picking up in part 2 of our deep dive. And we're back for more of the deep dive. The fog's still thick here in Victorian London, and the Jack the Ripper mystery. Well, that's even thicker. Before we jump back in time, we were talking about the legacy of this case. It's like Jack the Ripper's story somehow became part of who we are. Why do you think that is, expert speaker? What is it about this case that still has this hold on us?
You know, it's interesting. The Ripper case happened at this really pivotal time. More and more people were learning to read, newspapers were everywhere, and suddenly everyone had access to this gruesome story as it unfolded. Jack the Ripper became this morbid fascination, a symbol of the dark side hidden behind all that proper Victorian society stuff.
We talked about how the media went crazy at the time, but let's dig a bit deeper. Those over-the-top headlines, the details that were often exaggerated or just made up, how did that change the way we see serial killers today?
Think about it. The Ripper case basically wrote the playbook for how big crimes are covered. Focus on the gruesome stuff, the relentless hunt for the killer, the tension building and building. It's a formula you still see today. And sadly, it often means we forget about the victims, their stories, the bigger problems in society that made them vulnerable in the first place.
It's like the killer becomes, I don't know, a twisted kind of celebrity, and their notoriety grows with each new piece of information.
Exactly. And that's a slippery slope. That kind of media attention can spiral out of control. It might even inspire copycat crimes or put a ton of pressure on the police to find a suspect, sometimes sending them down the wrong path entirely.
So in a way, Jack the Ripper, because of how the Victorian media handled things, kind of became the model for how we see and react to serial killers even now.
I think you could say that, yeah. But it's important to remember that we know so much more about criminal psychology now than they did in 1888. We've moved past that simple evil monster idea and understand that these crimes happen for a lot of complicated reasons. Modern profiling, forensic psychology, all those tools mean we understand the motivations and patterns of serial killers in a much deeper way.
Okay, so let's talk about that evolution. How has our approach to investigating and understanding serial killers changed since Jack the Ripper was out there?
The most obvious change, of course, is technology. Imagine a crime scene now. DNA evidence, fingerprints, cameras everywhere. It's a totally different world from those gaslit streets back then. These tools let us connect suspects to crimes with a level of certainty they couldn't have even dreamed of back then.
And I imagine psychology plays a much bigger role now, am I right?
Absolutely. Understanding the psychology of a serial killer, why they do what they do, their MO. It's crucial, not just for catching them, but maybe even stopping future crimes. We're looking at social factors, triggers, even things in their biology that might make them predisposed. It's a much more well-rounded approach now.
It's wild how far we've come, yet the Ripper case still has this mystique. Maybe because it's never been solved, our minds just run wild with theories and fears.
Yeah, that allure of the unknown is powerful.
Right.
Everyone fancies themselves a detective, right? They have their own suspect, their own way of interpreting the clues. It becomes this puzzle that people keep trying to solve, even after all this time.
Speaking of clues, our sources talk about a bunch of dead ends the police ran into. They chased down every lead, questioned tons of people, but Jack the Ripper just vanished. What do those dead ends tell us about the challenges investigators faced at the time?
Well, take the Leather Apron case, for instance. The police, driven by public fear and rumors, first focused on finding someone who fit the profile of, say, a local butcher or slaughterhouse worker. That led them to John Picer, who was a Jewish shoemaker, but he just happened to have that nickname. They let him go quickly because there was no evidence.
So they targeted him because of his job and a bad nickname. Yikes. Talk about profiling gone wrong.
It shows how easily biases and assumptions can mess up an investigation, something we're still dealing with today. They also looked at doctors, anyone with medical knowledge because of the mutilations, but dead end. Whoever Jack the Ripper was, they seemed to understand how limited the police were and used it to their advantage.
It's like the Ripper was a ghost, moving through the shadows and using the fear and chaos they created as a weapon.
That sends chills down my spine, but it's true. The fear was real, and the lack of answers only made it worse. It got to the point that people started taking the law into their own hands. Our sources mention the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, just ordinary people so frustrated by the lack of progress that they started patrolling the streets themselves.
Can you imagine feeling so unsafe, so let down by the authorities that you feel like you have to go after a killer yourself?
It shows you how deep the distrust and anxiety ran in Whitechapel. The police were in over their heads and the public was terrified. That's how vigilantism starts. And that whole dynamic, the tension between communities and law enforcement when trust breaks down, that's something we see over and over throughout history, sadly. It happens even today.
It's a harsh reminder that some things, no matter how much we'd like them to, never really change. But going back to the investigation, it's interesting to consider the role technology played, or rather didn't play, in the Ripper case. Today, we're used to cameras everywhere, instant communication, DNA databases. Back then, they were stuck with eyewitness accounts, which are often unreliable, and physical evidence that could be tampered with so easily. Different world.
Completely. That lack of reliable technology made it almost impossible to track the Ripper, to connect the crimes, or find suspects with any real certainty. In a way, Jack the Ripper was like the ultimate ghost in the machine. They used the limits of the technology of the time to vanish.
It's like one of those detective stories where the killer is always one step ahead, toying with the police.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And the Ripper case, in a lot of ways, became a model for those classic whodunit stories. It got us hooked on unsolved mysteries, on trying to untangle these complex cases and figure out the criminal mind.
It's a good story. But we can't forget that behind the mystery, the headlines, and the speculation, there are real victims. Real women whose lives were taken from them.
You're absolutely right, and that's something we need to keep in mind. Those women, even though they're often just footnotes in the Ripper story, deserve to be remembered as people, not just victims. They had families, hopes, dreams, lives that were stolen away.
And that leads us to a really important part of our deep dive, the victims themselves. When we come back for our final part, we'll hear their stories, talk about the challenges of separating facts from myth, and look at why it's important to be sensitive when revisiting a case like this. Stick with us. And we're back. For this last part of our Jack the Ripper deep dive, we got to remember what truly matters at the heart of this story. The victims. It's easy to get lost in the mystery, the who did it, and all that, but these weren't characters in a story, expert speaker. These were real women whose lives were brutally cut short.
That's so true. And it's tragic in more ways than one. History has a way of reducing these women to just one thing. Jack the Ripper's victims. It's like even in death, those who were overlooked, the ones society didn't care for, their voices get silenced and forgotten.
Okay, so let's talk about the canonical five. We've got Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. You mentioned earlier how tough it is to piece together their lives, to separate the real from the sensationalized stories that always seem to pop up in cases like this.
It's like trying to rebuild something that's been shattered. You have these broken, twisted pieces, maybe a newspaper report from back then that focuses on the most scandalous stuff, or official records that don't tell you anything personal. But if we look closely at what we do have, we can at least try to give these women back some of the humanity that was stolen from them.
It's like we're giving them their voices back after all this time. What have we learned about the canonical five that helps us see them as people, as individuals?
One of the most important things we've learned is that it's not accurate to say all of these women were prostitutes when they were killed. That assumption, it's been challenged. Elizabeth Stride, for instance, she had her struggles with poverty, homelessness, sure, but she was apparently making a living by cleaning lodging houses, not sex work. We so often try to make victims fit into these neat little boxes, and in doing that, we miss the nuances of their lives.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that behind every statistic, every headline, there's a whole human being with a life, a story of their own. What about the other victims? What else have we found out?
Well, let's take Annie Chapman. She'd been married, had kids, but things went downhill after her young daughter died and she and her husband separated. She struggled with alcohol, poverty, all of that, but she was also writing letters home, trying to keep in touch with her family. That paints a very different picture than the typical, fallen woman story you often hear.
We start to see the fabric of their lives, the good times, the bad times, the things they were hoping for. It makes their deaths all the more tragic.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important not to reduce them to just being victims, names on a list. They were daughters, mothers, friends, and their stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
Absolutely. It's a serious reminder that when we approach these historical cases, especially when they involve people who are marginalized, we have to be careful, be sensitive, and be committed to finding the truth beneath those often warped narratives.
I couldn't agree more. It's about restoring dignity, remembering that every single life has value, no matter how simple or troubled it might have been.
Well said. Shifting gears a bit, we can't ignore how big of a mark Jack the Ripper left on our culture. Books, movies, even walking tours dedicated to him, and his legend is still alive and well. But with that comes a responsibility, don't you think? How do we engage with this story without exploiting the victims or romanticizing the violence?
That's the key, isn't it? We need to find a balance. It makes sense that people are drawn to the mystery, trying to solve the historical puzzle. But we can't forget about what it costs, the human cost. We can't let the victims just become parts of some macabre story.
So how do we not fall into that trap? How do we approach a case like this the right way?
For me, it boils down to respect, being accurate, and staying critical. We need to be aware of the language we're using. No sensationalism, no exploitation. Support research, documentaries, books that are ethical, that put the victims' stories first, and really try to understand the society they were living in.
So it's okay to be drawn to the mystery, but never at the cost of empathy and respect for those who lost their lives.
Precisely. And I think it's also crucial to remember that even though the Ripper case is infamous, it's just one example of a much bigger problem, violence against women, especially women struggling in poverty or living on the fringes of society. This case should make us think about those injustices that are still happening today.
It's something we need to think about, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I have to ask, will we ever know for sure who Jack the Ripper was? Is this case just going to remain unsolved forever?
Ugh. The million-dollar question, right? Even today, teams are looking at old evidence again with all these new forensic tools. You've got researchers going through mountains of old documents, and they're all hoping to find that one clue that breaks the case wide open. But so much time has passed. It's unlikely we'll ever know for sure.
So maybe, in a way, the mystery itself is part of the whole Jack the Ripper legacy.
Yeah, maybe. But for me, the biggest lesson here, the one that goes beyond the mystery, is this. Every life matters. We have to remember the victims, those women whose futures were stolen from them. And we have to use what we learned from the past to build a better future, a future where everyone is valued, everyone is safe.
Beautifully said. A powerful message to end on. We can't go back and change what happened, but we can learn from it, remember those who were lost, and work towards a world that's more just and more compassionate. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the chilling but thought-provoking world of Jack the Ripper. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep the memory of those we've lost alive.